All right, so in this video, I want to talk about how we can use the things we just learned about to think about interventions for increasing or maintaining bone strength. And by bone strength, I mean resistance to fracture, resistance to damage. This is a very important topic both for sports and clinical applications. From a sports perspective, people's susceptibility to stress fractures is highly dependent on their bone strength. And for general health, bone strength or lack thereof is a major cause of fractures from falls, which are a very serious health problem for the elderly, especially for elderly women. So what happens over the course of your lifetime is your bone strength, which we can sort of connect to your bone mass density. This comes, by the way, as you know from last week, this is measured from DEXA. We would measure bone mass, bone mineral density from with a DEXA machine. So your bone mass increases early on in life. It really starts to plateau during your 20s and 30s. And then as you get into old age, it decreases. Now, women have something called menopause, when their menstrual cycle stops. And because of the hormonal changes that happen there, for a lot of women, their bone mass starts to decrease precipitously once they reach middle age. Men typically reach, of course, everything here is population average, and we'll talk in a moment about things that affect where you fall on these population averages. Men tend to achieve higher total bone mass, and this figure is maybe not quite perfectly correct. That difference tends to only to start appearing during puberty. So it's maybe like they're the same, and then it starts to take off during puberty. And I think that has something to do with various hormonal differences between males and females that affect bone strength, and also muscle strength, because one great way to induce a lot of strain in your bones is to have strong muscles that generate large forces on your bones and therefore stimulate an increase in bone mass. But even men face decreases in bone mass. So one thing that changes the shape of these curves is physical activity. Probably the thing that changes the shape of these curves is physical activity. So let's, for the moment, let's think about, say, a male who is physically active throughout his lifespan. Well, first of all, he's going to have a more rapid rate of bone growth. Say you play sports in high school and do intramural sports in college and so on. Number one, you'll have more bone mass. Number two, you will lose it less dramatically. So it's way better to be here than to be down here. Sedentary people will lose bone mass more quickly. Same thing is true for females, right? Maybe you can't completely stop the effects of menopause, but being up here, much better than being down here. I have a figure showing what happens during puberty, because as you might imagine, what happens like right here is really important for bone mass later in life, because if you can get yourself like up here, you're in a much better position to stave off that decline later in life, versus if you only get yourself up here, you could be in real trouble. So here's a nice plot from a longitudinal study of boys and girls from age 4 to age 21. This, by the way, here, BMDL, that stands for bone mineral density at the lumbar spine. So this is DEXA machine scan. What is the bone density right there? So blast some x-rays at it, subtract off the muscles and fat. How dense is that bone? And now, because of the last unit we did, where that comes from, which is, by the way, why this is in it's grams of bone per cross-sectional area of the body. So you'll notice that for boys and girls, there are dramatic increases in bone strength during puberty. The reason why the girls' curve flattens off like this and the boys' curve does not is just as a function of when puberty happens. If they'd collected data out to like age 25, the boys' curve would also flatten off as well. But this suggests that interventions for bone strength would be quite useful during more or less this time frame, right? Kind of middle to high school-ish. And it turns out that if you are physically active during this time, doing those kinds of activities we talked about in the last video, high impact, high load activities, you will be up here. You'll be one of the scatter points that's higher up. If you're sedentary, you'll be further down. One more point I want to talk about that's specific to women, and depending if you've done some work in nutrition, maybe you're familiar with this. Girls who have eating disorders have a bone growth curve that looks like this. Because of how the amenorrhea effect that is caused by disordered eating, the two terms you'll see are female athlete triad. Also, maybe the more modern term is REDS for relative energy deficit in sports. But that messes with your estrogen levels, and that can cause a decrease in your ability to gain the benefits of bone growth induced by physical activity. It's like you're doing this activity that's signaling your body, hey, we need to remodel your bones, but you don't have the energetic and hormonal components to actually do it. So this is a reason why physical activity during adolescence is particularly important, and for females, why identifying and treating eating disorders early in life is very important. So there's another, well, let's talk about these points that we talked about in the last video to think about different interventions that might create strong signals for bone remodeling. So we want activities that create a high bone strain. So that essentially means big force, right? We want big forces. We want large strain rates. So maybe we could say like high impact. We want them to be maybe varied forces and impacts. And we want to target at least this many loading cycles. So let's say a sufficient dose for now. So maybe while I'm sketching out a few things here, think about what you might use as an intervention for this. For let's say good interventions for bone strength. Now I'll write down some of the ones that I know, and maybe you can compare that against what you were thinking about in the last minute or two. Things like soccer, basketball, volleyball, etc. These are great because there's lots of cutting to the left and to the right, jumping up and down at kind of odd angles, jumping to serve, different high impact, high force activities that are probably in a sufficient dose to induce bone strength. Plyometric exercises, box jumps and bounding and that are also great. Let's say I was going to write lifting, but let's write heavy lifting. Heavy lifts, because that would create large forces. And also Olympic style lifting, like maybe power cleans. Those would be great, of course, because they would create a high loading rate because you do them fast. Gymnastics, very good because there's a lot of like bounding and twisting and especially the landing from gymnastics. And then maybe something else, maybe like maybe skateboarding is another kind of off the wall example. But jumping and landing, high impact, high forces, these would all be great. A few things that aren't on here, maybe we can say like okay, but not perfect. would be running, my favorite sport. Now, why is this not so good? Well, it's not. It's fine. It's great, but the forces are high, the loading rates are high, but the repeats, the number of repetitions, is you might go for a run, you might take like 8,000 steps, and we know you only need 60 to 100 to induce strong bone response. So there's sort of like a opportunity cost there with all that time you spent running. Also, the loads in running are very repetitive, right? That's more like this versus like this. And then maybe not so good cycling and swimming. So what do these have in common? They're relatively low loads, and they are relatively low loading rates. And generally the loading rates or the loads are very repetitive. One more thing I want to touch on with lifting here is something that we'll get to a lot more later in this class. But I want to point out that, let's look at the full skeleton here. One of the benefits of lifting in regards to bone growth, bone strength, is you might think, okay, yeah, if I'm doing a squat, say, there's a heavy load because I've got this big, or however much you squat, barbell on your back, and that weight is pushing down, and that's true. So suppose you're like modestly fit and you squat your body weight. So maybe you weigh 170 pounds, you squat 170. So that means the total load on, let's say, your femur would be about 2 times your body weight. But what's so great about lifting is that when you squat, there's huge muscle forces that need to be created in your quads, in your hamstrings, in your glutes back here. And all of those forces act on the bone. So from the perspective of the bone, let me draw out a little femur here. The femur experiences your body weight above it. It experiences the barbell, and it experiences the reaction forces from your body weight, the reaction force from the barbell, and the muscle forces from the muscles coming off it. And of course, there's reaction forces to that from the joint below. So it's not just the weight of the barbell, it's the muscular force from your muscles that push into the bone and induce more, and you know what this is now, compressive loading. So can you see how all of these would create this high compressive force in the bone? With regards to this, and with regards to especially like planning, programming interventions for bone strength, there's one more thing I want to point out, which has to do with this remodeling process we talked about earlier. So I talked about how this happens. So you have some bone damage. Say you start doing a plyometrics program that induces some damage here. You activate your osteoclasts. They come in and start cleaving away, eating away at old bone. The osteoblasts come in, start laying down new bone. Bone mineralizes and turns into osteocytes, and you have new, stronger bone. Great. There's now the timing of these things is a little tricky. So here's what this actually looks like sort of temporally. You start doing your plyometrics training right here. And this is like bone strength on the y-axis here. And those osteoclasts come in and they eat away at bone. And that happens for like a month. And your osteoblasts don't really get activated for that first maybe 4 weeks or so. Then they start ramping up and your bone production increases and your bone gets stronger. And then you level off at some new higher bone strength. And it takes maybe 6 months to really get the full increase that you're going to get from some, say, new stimulus and training. Now, as you may have noticed, there's this kind of danger zone right here where because of the activity of osteoblasts or of osteoclasts, see how easy it is to get these confused? That's why I remember the B for building and the C for cleaving. Notice there's this danger zone right here where your bones are actually weaker than when you started. So one consequence of this, I talked earlier about military recruits at boot camp. When you do these studies of military recruits, what you see is that the highest rate of injury doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen right away when these out-of-shape people start doing really intense training. It actually happens about a month into boot camp, and that's exactly what you would expect based on the cellular biology of how bone remodels. So I thought that would be a good way to close out this video, to see how some of this like microscopic stuff applies to very macroscopic things, and also to very practical things like how would you design a training program for bone strength.